Who are we binding to our altars when we don't explore the space between the text and the command? Whose necks are we baring as we lift up our knives? And what divine voices are we refusing to hear as we prepare to plunge them down? Who do we sacrifice when we can only see the peshat, in Jewish hermeneutics, the simple, obvious, literal meaning of a biblical text, and refuse to look for the derash, another interpretive technique that involves plumbing the depths of the text to find new meanings and possibly bringing out lessons that may not have been intended by the original authors? That is a quote from an article that was sent in a chat group that we're part of. And that kind of gets to the heart of, so last video that I made about gender and sexuality, I was talking about moving from one kind of framework of defining these things, which includes some and excludes others, and moving and doing the work in order to move to a different one, and why I have done that, and why I want to invite other people to do that. And that quote expresses why. Because there are real people living their lives in this world with us that we could include, and that we ought to include, and that are demonstrably suffering for not being included. And the symbolic language of, am I talking to Christians in this video? I don't even know. Religious symbolic language offers a framework and is powerful enough and expansive enough to include queer people without breaking, without falling apart. And if you don't, then you could just live in a more limited world. And I guess it's mostly your loss. There was somebody who was saying that they do not view queer people or like trans or gay people as a legitimate, as an identity group, like it doesn't exist as an identity group. Which I'm like, but look around, like, we do exist. But I think, as I said to that, there's a quote from somebody that says that one of the main causes of evil in the world is a failure of imagination. And in the past, people and cultures have failed to have the imagination to include women, or to include people of other races, or to include disabled people, physically or mentally, disabled people as, or neurodivergent people, as full human beings. And that has caused harm. And in the same way, cultures today do not have the imagination to include queer people as people. And that's the rub, to me, is simply a failure of imagination and like a lack of empathy, understanding. Of course, it becomes really difficult when you come from a certain background which has taught certain habits of perception and like of judgment and of morality. And with me, it's definitely this way. I am right now working on unlearning, or like I guess the term is deconstructing, a lot of those habits that were instilled in me and are very habitual. We attach a sense of virtue or reverence to a certain outward image of a certain way of being. And then it becomes difficult to, things outside of that are just seen as like weird or like lesser. And there's a sense of like being like morally lesser, when what's really going on is just difference. And I think this is just idolatry, giving a more ultimate and transcendent kind of emotion and kind of reverence to something that exists on a lower level, that's just a pattern of the body, that's just a pattern of culture, that's just not actually divine, or any more divine than the whole world is divine. But it is very, very difficult to uproot these things, like for me, and it's just, it goes so deep, like to question them. For me, like we often will go and watch kind of either critical commentary on, or just like the documentaries of cults or like fundamentalist groups, because there's a certain comfort and familiarity and like sense of rightness and virtue habitually for me in seeing like a traditional family structure with the girls with like long hair and skirts and this sort of attitude of conformity in the family, and the guys like being outside and like doing more manual stuff, and the kind of authority structure. It's I know that that is just one way of being, and in fact that the way that it's enacted by these people is involved with abuse and is causing them harm, and that has caused me harm in the past. But even so, even though I'm somebody who doesn't affirm that as like the right way of being, those habits of perception are still there. So I think that's why it's so hard to talk to conservatives, but especially religious, and for me that's usually Christian conservatives, because religious people, we have this concept of the divine, of the good with a capital G, of the way, of the universe and the right pattern of things. And these are very powerful and very emotionally charged sort of concepts, and it all depends upon what you attach those to. But if you attach that to something, it's very like a stronghold. It's like, it's very powerful, for good or bad, to have this concept of like divinity and of the good. And it's very difficult to unleash that from the ways in which it's been confined and made conditional and limited. And I'm somebody, when I, deconstructed. My fundamentalist religion, we didn't want to get rid of those concepts of the transcendent or the divine or the good or like universal goodness and hope. Those are powerful things. And to me, it's just that conservative and limiting systems like put them in like cages and put them under conditions that are false, but they can be very powerful. That said, so I feel bad and I feel kind of like going through a minefield even trying to talk about this, especially in that kind of space and in that kind of audience, because I feel guilty like I'm doing something, like I'm impinging on something sacred by by rocking the boat, or by suggesting that maybe what people are framing as this is God's way is really just plain old fear of difference or plain old bigotry and misinformation. Just because you put the name of God on something doesn't mean that it is of God. But I have immense reverence for God and for devotion and worship. So it's difficult for me to understand that a lot of the things that people do in the name of God is not deserving of that name, and it's taking that name in vain in it. Because it feels like I'm messing something up, but it's not. And I think I said it's that failure of imagination that fails. The truth is that the failure of imagination that fails to include queer people is the same kind of thing as in the past and in other cultures has failed to include, again, disabled people or people of other races or women. It is something that is entirely human, limited, limiting. There's nothing sacred about that. So, but the process of coming to terms with that, even for somebody like me who already operates from the assumption that this is true and that, I need to deconstruct these things, it is still difficult and it's still a long process. So for somebody who is still kind of giving reverence and giving their life into these conservative patterns, and I say conservative because I don't want to say traditional, because usually I try to be more positive with the way that I use traditional versus conservative. Anyway, that's even harder because it kind of goes against your instincts, because your instincts have been trained in a certain way. And it's really hard because, I don't know, sometimes your instincts are correct and we need to go with them, and sometimes your instincts are covering up even deeper instincts that are the real instincts. It's all discernment, honestly, in life. One of our only spiritual practices that we've been able to keep as a routine, at least now, is just like lighting a candle as a kind of prayer, and it's like for discernment every time. Pretty much that's my one prayer. Anyway, to the end of reclaiming that sense of beauty and order and harmony and divinity and rightness and being in God's will and in God's pattern for the kind of life, for the life that I lead, and for a wider spectrum of the human experience that doesn't involve the kind of abuse that my past way of living involved. What am I saying? In the interest of reclaiming that sense of dignity, rightness, beauty, etc., we've been watching, just thinking about this and like relearning things and watching a lot of videos. Car horn. Or alarm. And there was one good one by the YouTube channel. It's called Jessie Gender. And she did a video on, like, from a secular perspective on, like, gender and sex, and kind of questioning or, like, giving more nuance to the idea of, like, the binary. I don't remember what it's called, but I'm basically just going to recapitulate it here with the added context of also kind of hoping to incorporate more, like, symbolic or metaphysical aspects, because most of the people who do these kinds of videos don't believe in that stuff, and so they don't incorporate it into their worldview. So I have to kind of read that in, or put it in for me when I translate it. Yeah. But the idea that she presents is, like, it's kind of to add some nuance to most the kind of basic idea of, like, so you have man and woman, and this is what's in that, and that's what's in that, and, like, there's these two boxes, and, you know, a trans man is biologically a woman or female, and a trans woman is biologically a man or female, etc. This doesn't get into sexuality. I guess I'm not going to get into that. To me, it's just such a non-issue that it's hard for me to, like, but it's such an issue for some people, and people have gone through so much pain too, so I'm like, well, but yeah, to me it's just, I'm like, it's just not an issue. Because it makes so much sense for me to be bi, like, I don't understand. Yeah. Anyway. So, there's things that people will cite, and I guess the prerequisite for this kind of framing is to not feel super threatened by giving this kind of nuance. Because, like, for a lot of people, that's bad to even, like, there's blocks up to even looking into it more. Because you think there's, like, an agenda behind it. So then you have to protect yourself from that, and are, like, distrustful and can't accept what is, like, common sense because of, like, suspicion and distrust. But that's not the way that we are in any other area of life. Like, math gets taught in a very basic way, and then later in a college course, you would discover nuances that seem to overturn or change the base, or add a different light to the basics that you learned in, like, 5th grade, or science, or basically any aspect of life has the pop kind of version of it, and then you get into the weeds, and that's just how it is. And so, especially with something like sex and gender, that's so, what do I want to say? I don't know, it's very much like an embodied and, like, a personal issue. It's not going to be clear cut. I've tried a couple times to, like, make this video. I'm not really sure if the thoughts are flowing. But I gotta talk to somebody later today, or just some people I've run into in real life who are, like, probably pretty conservative, and so I'm trying to hype myself up. Again, because I feel bad. I feel guilty. I feel like I'm trespassing on something sacred. And, I try to have, and that's good in the sense that I should have, it's good in the sense that I should have respect for a person who is a nice person, and not just, like, laugh at them and mock them the way that I would kind of, a bunch of really mean, like the Westboro Baptist Church or something, that you wouldn't really consider worthy of a nuanced discussion. Like, so it's good that sense, but I overdo it. Like, you can have respect, but some things are just human traits that could be dealt with like any other human trait, or fear, or ignorance, or prejudice, or bias. We all have them, but there can't need to be the shell of like words like God and Jesus and the scripture and things and God's design and things have so much power to us, and people can use them, and people will use them to defend or to hold up stuff that's really just kind of wood, hay, and stubble, and it's not worthy of that. But you use the words, so it gives this facade of like being something special and holy and untouchable, when really it's just human error, bias, and prejudice. There are things that are divine. There are things that are God's, the design in the universe, and however you want to put that. But there are things that could be described that way, and there are things that are transcendent and like holy and like sacred. Like, for instance, each being's right over themselves to describe and express their own experiences and interpret them, and to have a free will. Like, that is divine, transcendent, holy, sacred, worthy of respect and reverence. But all my life, for all our life, that idea of dignity of each self has been laughed at and mocked as something shallow and facile. And so it's very difficult for me to see that that idea is actually incredibly powerful and worthy of being foundational, and bears very good fruit when it is foundational, as opposed to ideas that are couched in the language of this very sacred and holy language that are really just kind of laughable and, at the very least, just shallow and flawed. So you kind of get somebody like with our background has a bit of a skewed vision and a skewed sense of priorities that's got to be interrogated, hopefully without losing the good, but you do want to lose the bad. So anyway, what Jesse was talking about, which again, Jesse doesn't say, this is the way that God created the world, and this is God's design, and that if you follow will lead to fruitfulness and happiness. I am habituated to trust and give reverence to things that are couched in those terms, even if the ideas themselves are weak, shallow, narrow. And anything that's couched simply as a scientific principle or somebody's perspective, I have the instinct to just kind of scorn, as opposed to the things that are built up with this religious language. But the way that I see it, this pattern that I'm going to describe is a lot more worthy of being described as the way the universe was created, God's plan for the universe, than the stuff about, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve kind of language. And it's such a travesty that people like me have been habitually see it another way. But anyway, what she talks about is like a sort of scale, and this is difficult to see. It was from my notes, but just so you get a slight visual aid. A scale that goes from what we would think of as like very deep biological sex characteristics, and I have put symbolic categories even deeper than that, and that's what I'm adding to this. To things that we would think of as like very kind of subjective cultural like gender stuff that even maybe some conservatives would agree is just a cliche or isn't really going into the whole design of the two genders or sexes or whatever. But she shows how these are really, they don't exist as two boxes that are 50-50, everybody goes in. It's like all of this is kind of mutable and variable. So you have XX and XY chromosomes, and then you have the like genitalia. I think there's like primary and secondary sex characteristics. That might be a term for this, but I actually unfortunately don't know what that means yet. And then you have kind of the general terms of like boy, girl, man, woman. And then you have, okay, well, boys will generally have flat chests, deeper voices, maybe be taller, have more body hair. Okay, and girls will have like breasts, higher voices, less body hair, etc. And then you have on the next level something like character, like boys will be more stoic or more intellectual, athletic, leaders, girls emotional, supportive, caring. And then on the last level you have stuff like boys will wear pants, which obviously is very kind of distinct between cultures, or have short hair, again, something that's changed. Blue, something that's changed, but that is the cultural moment now. Certain gestures and like slang and like posture, and the same for girls. Certain way of dressing, cadence of voice, stuff like that. And I guess even in cultures where they have, I don't know enough about that to speak, but I know there are some cultures, like indigenous cultures, that have a certain language that only women use amongst themselves, stuff like that. Anyway, so this is all stuff that we could say gets into that category of like that people argue about, or that trans people and genderqueer people like play with, or even just cis people who don't conform to the standards that people think you should conform to play with. So like the fact is, you could have an intersex person who has different chromosomes, and you might not even know about that until you get some medical procedure done. But everybody in life treats you, as a certain gender. Other people have articulated this part like better than me. Oh, and I forgot to add, there's like the kind of metaphysical principles of like the masculine and the feminine are kind of like really, I don't want to say abstract in a negative sense, but abstract, like transcendent, like they're way up here, or deep, you could say, in the level of existence. Like, it's so symbolic that it's fractal and intertwined at every level of existence. So, you could have an almost kind of reversible, like symbolic categories. To me, it's not a strong argument in any way for conservative gender norms or for there being only two straight categories, because I can just play with it so easily. Symbolic patterns in their very nature are asking to be played with, and like I mean, first of all, it's always fractal. Even like, okay, in Christian gender, like male, masculine, feminine patterns, the soul is feminine compared to God, and then the soul is masculine compared to the body. Like it's relational always with these symbolic patterns. It's um a woman is in the masculine like leadership position over her children, and then like a father, if he's caring for his children and supporting and nurturing them, that's a feminine thing, that falls into that category of like the words that I use are Sidene and Sidar from the Wheel of Time, but those aren't widely spread. So it falls into like the category of being a matrix, nurturing, providing a space for something to grow. I'm getting somewhat tired. I think the main thing that I wanted to talk about was just like relearning habits and habits of perception, how that can make it really difficult to talk about or think straight about certain aspects of reality because you're so scared to, or because there's certain preconceived notions. And maybe I'll get into the rest of this later. But yeah, she just offers a more nuanced way of thinking about gender that, going back to the beginning of the video about who are we cutting off, allows us to still understand that there are patterns and there's order in reality, while including a much broader swath of people who are living their lives, will continue to live their lives or our lives in love and, just living, and allows us to include them. And she talks about like sex or gender as like a cluster property, which kind of gets into Gestalt theory for me, which is like, so you have the idea of man, and then you have all these kind of properties that cluster around that. That could be anything from, body hair to being stoic to wearing this or that to using he, him pronouns to having higher testosterone to having a certain type of body. And we can put different emphasis on different aspects. And so, basically, if you have enough of the property, you get kind of put into that category, or maybe you want to put yourself into that category. But like different people will put different emphasis on different properties in the cluster. And there's no way to draw specific lines. You can't draw hard lines. And that's just the way reality works. I mean, you can't draw hard lines. If you try to, you're going to be miserable and sad. But yeah, and it's putting different emphases. So and that's okay to put different emphasis. It doesn't destroy it. It really doesn't. Because we know, even with cis people, that it's okay to sometimes emphasize different aspects of the cluster property. For instance, if things that are in the category of woman are having children, being a mother, being pregnant, having breasts, and having like long hair. And yet, if there is a woman who, is a woman and identifies as a woman and loves that, and she has cancer and has to have her hair shaved off, and she has to like have a mastectomy, and she can't have kids, she might have trouble feeling like a woman because she does not conform to a lot of these big aspects of womanhood that are in this cluster property. And she might feel really like depressed about that. And I think that everybody could agree that the thing to do is to continue to support her as a woman, and that this person is still a woman. even if she doesn't look like a woman or can't do a lot of the things that women, like, we understand that she should be upheld as a woman still. So even in the realm of like the conservative way of understanding gender and sex and sexuality, there can be nuance, and we kind of all just like kind of instinctively understand it, unless you're like really mean. um yeah, or just confused. Is this in Proverbs? Does this have to do with like the Proverbs distinction between like different types of foolishness? I don't know. Because I know in Proverbs there's a lot about like don't be a mocker, and then there's like don't be a fool, and some of it seems to be about dealing with people who are just uninformed, and then some of it seems to be about dealing with people who are like vicious, and that seems to be relevant, especially in this whole issue, because there is so many cases of people like really having, either religious or secular people having underneath really kind of poisonous feelings or agendas. We like the word agenda. And then on the surface they'll like couch it in terms that sound fine, but like it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so it's hard to take anybody at their face value, and you use a lot of discernment, and yeah, it's tough. Anyway, cluster properties. And she was also talking about it like kind of a double, there's a word for this, but like a double bell curve type of a shape, where you have these. And if you meet all of these traits or all of these traits, then you're in the very, this line in like the top of it where you meet all of them. But there's plenty of like cis women with deeper voices who are muscular and athletic, who don't want to have kids, and they have short hair, and they have chromosomes and breasts and whatever. And, cis men who have, similar things, and they would be like in here or something. But they still vaguely go into that category. And honestly, it's like gender has become like this whole issue, or is just this whole issue in the world, but with other categories that are not so much a war zone and people are getting hurt over them. We understand that this is just the way that the world works with any category across the board. Like, it's just how things exist. It's how reality lays itself out, in Jonathan Pageau's words. And I think it's cool and beautiful and worthy of reverence. And so I'm just actively and continually trying to have a healthier way of perception. It's really funny. Just before we had our epiphany moment, kind of got out of the cult area environment that we were in, one of the last like topics of Bible study that we were really into and patterns was of, there's verses in one of the epistles where it talks about like love and judgment, and loving the right things and learning to love the good, and how that being and having the right priorities and kind of an order of affections, a proper order of affections, and how that is tied up with properly seeing and properly discerning. And funny enough, that happened for us and continues to happen for us and continues to be a theme. Yeah. To close, I'm just going to reread that quote, and it does use those two terms, peshath and derash, which are like terms in Judaism about like the literal interpretation of a text versus kind of different nuances and homiletical contextual interpretations that are more creative, something that's frowned upon in conservative times. But yeah, I'm just going to use those two terms, but that's what they mean. So again, the kind of beginning and end point is who, because everything is relational and everything is perspectival, is in the end, who are we binding to our altars? when we don't explore the space between the text and the command? Whose necks are we baring as we lift up our knives, and what divine voices are we refusing to hear as we prepare to plunge them down? Who do we sacrifice when we can only see the Peshat and refuse to look for the Derash?